the US trying to conquer Cuba? After Venezuela, the US has set its sights on the Caribbean island.
Cuba is really a nation that's very close to failing. You know, they got their money from Venezuela, they got the oil from Venezuela, they're not getting that anymore.
The US has also been pressuring Mexico to stop sending oil to Cuba. Without all this oil, it's estimated that Cuba only has a few weeks of energy left to power the country. But why is the US so determined to bring down Cuba anyway? Especially since, unlike Venezuela, the country imports rather than exports oil. Let's take a look at how the US has been trying to bring Cuba under its control, from its early days as an independent country up through the Cuban Revolution and the Cold War. First, to understand the relationship between the US and Cuba, we need to go back to Cuba's fight for independence from Spain. Cuban nationalists fought to break free from Spain's colonial empire for decades, causing the country to develop a strong base of support for independence. Near the end of Cuba's final war of independence, the United States intervened on the side of Cuba. This is known in the US as the Spanish-American War, but this intervention had self-serving interests. The US actually intended on kicking Spain out of the Western Hemisphere in the name of the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine called for keeping Europe out of the Americas, but not to support self-determination in the Western Hemisphere. The US actually wanted imperial control of the Americas for themselves. So when the US entered the Spanish-American War, many in Washington called for the annexation of Cuba by the United States. That's what happened to former Spanish colonies like Puerto Rico and the Philippines after the US defeated Spain. But the move was blocked by Congress. So the US occupied Cuba after the war, promising to pull its forces out once a new government was in place. But here's the thing, the US really did want control over the island. And so when Cuba was drafting its constitution in 1901, the US forced it to include an amendment that would allow Cuba's powerful neighbor to intervene on the island when it saw fit. The Constitution also grants the US a perpetual lease for US military bases. That's how the US kept hold of Guantanamo Bay. While several US-friendly regimes ruled Cuba for the next half-century, resentment bubbled underneath for decades because many Cubans felt they didn't break free from Spain just to be dominated by the US. That would all change in 1959, when the Cuban Revolution overthrew US-backed dictator Fulgencio Batista. The revolution ended indirect control by the US over the island's politics and economy, and that's an outcome the US has been determined to reverse ever since.